Welcome to No Place Like Home with Mike and Megan Orp, where we believe the center of the universe is your home and our home and every other home on the planet. On this podcast, we talk about anything related to that. Parenting, homeschooling, marriage, anything, as long as it has to do with being home.
On today's podcast, we're going to talk about how to get started homeschooling. Welcome to the podcast. We're glad you're all here.
Yeah, welcome.
And are excited to have our little conversation today. We're always appreciative of those who listen and leave us reviews on the podcast. I think the only place you can actually really leave reviews that we see is on Apple Podcasts, but we appreciate you listening. We appreciate your insight and your words of encouragement on the reviews. Do we want to share a couple of those today, Megan?
Sure. Love to.
Awesome. Have you got some?
Yeah, our newest one comes from Mandy Marr, and she said, I love this podcast and listening to Mike and Megan. Their insight and wisdom is so encouraging, and every episode is relatable. I can't wait to see what the rest of this podcast brings.
Awesome.
Well, thanks, Mandy.
Thank you, Mandy.
That's really nice.
That's super awesome. Very nice.
Yeah, it's really nice. I often say this, but I get a lot of fear. I guess I get a vulnerability hangover every time I record a podcast. And so, you kind of like, what did I say? And like, do I believe that 100% of the time? Like, you're kind of going back through everything you said. And I really appreciate all of the feedback we get, and that's been very supportive. And I guess I hope that means that you guys know that we're talking and that we're not like actually like inscribing into stone the things that we're saying. And so like last week we talked about homeschooling, and this week we're going to talk about homeschooling. I wondered afterwards the whole week, like, did I say anything? Because not every person in the world maybe is suited for this. There are different circumstances, and where a group school situation might be actually better serve your family. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, did I leave a space for that? And so I really do appreciate the positive reviews, because it's scary.
Yeah,
it's scary to just say things, especially in the environment that we find ourselves in 2021. Nobody wants to put their head up and say anything, right?
It's a little scary to declare something.
So
we appreciate that. So if you're listening, we would love it if you'd leave us a review. That helps us out and encourages us, and also just helps the podcast in general. So leave a review, and also share it with your friends. If you've got friends who are, especially on these episodes, homeschooling or thinking about homeschooling, we're hoping that we have some useful information for you here. Yeah.
And that's ultimately why we started the podcast, because we were, really trying to write a book. Yeah. And most of our time writing was spent talking, and we were even recording our conversations and then like using this app to like dictate that into text or whatever.
Transcribe it.
Yeah, transcribe it. And it was like, I don't know, man. Maybe we'll write that book, but maybe we should just have a podcast, because talking is really easy and for us, and writing's really hard. So that's why we're here.
So before we launch into our topic for the day, we like to kind of talk about what we've been sort of thinking about or experiencing lately. And for me, I was actually just today sort of noticing that our house is a little bit messy right now. And
no comment.
But where I'm taking this is that I tend to be sort of I don't want to say clean freak, but I like things to be
in harmony
and in order. And when you have a family with 9 children and 2 parents, you're constantly fighting the battle to kind of keep that in place. And it really you don't ever win, except for maybe like for a moment when it's all put together and then things start to fall apart again. But this morning I was looking around, and I've noticed that Megan's got this painting project she's doing. And we pulled some furniture in from the garage, and we've got the kitchen table over in the family room essentially. And I was actually surprised that I'm okay with it. Because I think over the years I have started to recognize that mess means things are happening in a family.
Yeah. Not always, but some of the time it does.
Yeah. And so I appreciate when there's projects happening, when you have to move things around because you're doing something. And I'm surprised how I'm okay with it. And part of it was we got a comment today on one of our YouTube videos about, it was a really nice one, about someone saying like they very accurately went through all the stuff that parents of 9 kids probably have to do, and what we do with our different responsibilities. And I thought, well, I really appreciated that, and also realizing that in order for things to happen in a family, you can't be on top of everything all the time, and that's okay.
Yeah.
And when it comes down to it, it doesn't really matter that this thing is left out on this table for a certain amount of time. It's more about what's the general feeling in your home, and kind of what are you doing with yourselves at home. And I was grateful for that comment, but it also made me kind of reflect on just our lives in general and how we sort of operate. And I'm glad that we have a mess. We have messes, and it usually means we're doing something. And for me, that's sort of a win, because I've been able to evolve in my thinking so that I'm okay with the messes a little bit more.
Yeah. That is good. I will say, I'll play devil's advocate because I'm the messy one, that I have really grown to have a real firm belief in the necessity of a happy home being clean.
Sure. Okay.
And so there's different types of messes, right?
Yeah.
There's
I like the project messes.
Yeah.
Are much more acceptable, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that's what you're talking about but there's definitely, I don't think it's conducive to a happy home to have a mess that comes from inattention.
Right.
Where, there's actual filth.
Yeah, right.
I do think it's hard to be happy in a space like that.
That's
and
true.
I think that's important. It can make you sick, right?
Yeah, that's true.
I think we give this idea of homemaker. At least I grew up feeling why are women supposed to clean or whatever like that. But I realize now that whoever's at home, it's important it does matter.
Right.
It's really important work, cleaning. And I'm terrible at it. I can say that as someone who I just don't see it. I don't see it, and it's really difficult for me to understand how to get from point A to point B when it comes to cleaning. It's incredibly overwhelming for me. And I'm learning, and I'm appreciative that my children who are more like me are learning, because Mike's so good at knowing how to get from A to B, so he teaches all of us. But I'm also really grateful to have a home that is fairly clean. And but I appreciate the mess of projects too.
I think a good project mess is great. It's just fine. But even before, I think even project messes to me were bothersome.
Oh, yeah.
And so I think you and I both kind of come toward a middle kind of ground.
Yeah.
And also it does help, because this person said, I don't know how you keep it clean, and also I don't know how you keep your laundry going, because it's true with 10 people in a house, there's a lot of laundry. It's like, well, the kids do a lot of that. We've done a lot to have everybody sort of pitch in. Yeah,
one of Mike's geniuses, his gifts, is setting up systems that create harmony. And so it's been amazing for our family how he has created just a flow for a workflow for the family, so that it's not a burden and everybody knows
one person.
It's we are run like a really great ship, and we feel like a crew. Everybody has their roles, and everybody understands that they're an important part of it, and I really love it.
Yeah.
But what was I going to say? Oh, it's interesting to me when I started working on this project, what is it, 2 days ago?
Oh,
I'm working on some furniture.
Painting some furniture, yeah.
As soon as I did, others did too.
Oh, started doing stuff.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that in another episode. We call that modeling.
Yeah.
It's just, we've seen that time and time again, that if you want your kids to do something, then do something yourself.
Yeah, they should be able to observe you doing it.
Yeah, set up a culture at home where you're doing stuff all the time. And because as soon as I started working on the furniture, they kind of hung around me for a little bit. And then I saw Jude came inside and started building stuff with hot glue and cardboard. And Asher's pretty good now. He was over at the warehouse doing stuff with his forge.
Yeah, it's blacksmithing.
But that's one thing I noticed. And then another thing I thought about yesterday, and this is kind of related, I decided to paint a mural or like do flowers on one of my pieces of furniture for this client that I have. And she really likes, she was showing me things that she loves, and she loves bright colors and patterns and stuff like that. And so I thought, well, I'll do it. It's been a while since I've done it. So I was nervous. And as I got started, it looked awful. And I was particularly aware of it because I was doing a time lapse. I'm like, this looks so bad. And I felt like kind of like shame and like, but there was
didn't help
small
that I
part
was off camera, like telling you how bad it looked.
No,
too,
no.
the whole time.
Mike wasn't even here. But I had to keep reminding myself, like, it always looks bad in the middle. It never looks good at this point. And it's like, but this time it might still be bad.
Even when Bob Ross is making a painting,
Yeah,
you
you're like,
think,
that was a bad idea.
That doesn't look like a good tree.
Why do you, like, I always, whenever I watch Bob Ross, I'm like, you just ruined it. Why did you put that blue there? That's weird. It's not supposed to be blue.
But then it all comes together.
Yeah, it all comes together. And Esther was good because I was like, this time, I don't know, man. I might just have to paint over the whole thing and start over. And I was like, ah. And she's like, you don't like it? She's like, I think it's going to look good. It always ends up looking good. So that was helpful.
That's nice.
But I mean, even
what's
though
the
I've done
lesson
it
there?
many times, there's still a point where I think, but this time is the time where it's just not going to work.
The process won't work.
And then Esther also reminded me of what I've said before. Like, if it doesn't look good, you're just not done yet. And it's like, you're right. I won't finish till it looks good. It's not like I'm done and it looks bad. It's like, well, no, you're not done then.
Right.
And so life is like that, you know, like if it doesn't look good yet, or if it hasn't worked out yet, you're just not done. It's not over.
Wow,
you know?
Esther had some good words of wisdom for
I know
you yesterday.
She does.
That's great when your kids start kind of repeating back to you some of the things you've said to them to encourage you.
Yeah, it was great. I needed it.
Like
and I'm
you
like,
came full
yes,
circle.
okay. And it did. Like a couple hours later, I was happy with it. I mean, it's not done, but I can see now like it's going to work out.
I don't think it's quite looking yet, Megan.
Yeah. I'm still in my paint clothes.
Yep.
And I haven't
She's
showered
sitting
yet
here in
today, but
overalls.
I'm not done. So there was no point in showering and then going back to get
And we
messy
had to
again.
take the chance to record this podcast because Eve and Jude are out of the house. So
They're at their cousin's house.
Yeah.
So
all right, those are some good little lessons for you out there, some little nuggets. Okay, well let's go ahead and get into our topic today, which is homeschooling. And so we started on the last podcast, kind of talking about our motivations, why we started homeschooling. And today we want to talk about, I guess, where you can start and where you should start, not just physically like task one, but more mentally, how to get yourself in the right place to do this. And this is really based on how we do it. So we said this before, there's a million different ways to homeschool your kids, but we have a certain way that we do it, and we wanted to share that with our listeners. And so this is all based on our own experience, I guess is what it comes down to. Everything we're going to share.
well, it would be silly to base it on somebody else's if it didn't,
Well,
if it didn't
I
work
guess
in our life.
You could read someone else's book and then,
Which we have done, but we're taking what we've read and then what's worked for us and all of the things that have been really helpful for us and sharing them. So I get asked very often from moms that want to get started in homeschooling. They'll message me and say, we're thinking of homeschooling, or we've decided to homeschool. Tell me where we should get started. And I know that they're hoping I'm going to say like, okay, get this book. And sometimes I do tell them about books, or go to this website or buy these things. Yeah. Like, but and I think in the past I might've done that and kind of meandered around with them. It's a huge question.
Yeah. You can't just answer that in 5 minutes.
But I do have what I always ask now is, well, before we go into any of that, because usually they'll say like, we want this or that, and they're this age and they're good at this or whatever. But I'll say like, well, before we go into any of that, what are your goals for your kids? What are you hoping? Like, how will you know you've been successful as a parent?
Right. With their education or?
Yeah. Or even in general, like, how do you know you've been successful? And it may be in particular with their education, because we're talking about homeschooling, but it's surprising, but maybe not surprising, that they're always like, oh, I'm going to have to think about that.
Yeah, they don't necessarily have an answer.
Yeah, and I think there was a point in time where I didn't either, and I think that's important. I guess
Is that what you're saying?
It's strange that we've gotten to a place where we don't even know what constitutes success anymore. We're just doing the things that everybody else is doing, taking for granted like that, like if we do the things, then we're successful parents.
Right.
But it's like, but what is success? How do you define it? Where are you trying to get your kids? And then you can say, are the things that everybody's telling me to do or that they're doing, and I'm feeling pressure to do, are those things actually effective in getting us to the goal?
Right.
And so I think one of the reasons I was kind of aware of that is because as we were when Elijah was about school age, about to start school, you and I were having kind of this early life crisis where we realized
we had an early life crisis
well,
in midlife.
You get out of college, and even college, we feel a little bit like this. Everybody's like, what are you going to major in? What are you going to major in? What are you going to major in? And you're like, I have no idea.
Yeah.
How would I know? And so then they're like, well, maybe you should look at who's hiring. And you're like, okay.
Or what sectors.
Yeah, like there's a lot of jobs in this sector. It's like, but I don't even know if I'd be good at that or if I'd like it or whatever. And we got lots of different advice on how to choose what you're going to be or what you're going to do. And then we ultimately obviously did. And once we were out of school, you get a job and then you're like, I don't really know what we're doing here. But I can't even say what I would do otherwise. And so we were kind of in this crisis and started to ask ourselves, what could we have done better so that we aren't in our mid to late 20s or even into our early 30s? We still felt this way. What could we have done better to be better prepared so that we're not trying to figure this out now? Because you realize, like, actually, I might have liked to be doing this with my time, but I have to go back to the beginning to get to this.
Yeah.
And then you're like, well, what was all that I just did? It's like, how can I help my kids actually know who they are before they go to college? That was my first thought. Because you start to look back and you're like, it's at 17, they don't ask you who you are and what you want. They say, just do the thing we're asking you to do. Don't question it. In fact, don't even put your spin on it too much.
Yeah.
Because we want this thing.
Right.
We want it exactly as we're telling you. And then at 18, they're like, so what do you like to do? What are you interested in? What would you like to spend the rest of your life doing? And you're like, I don't know. And so it was like, that was part of our thinking as we were starting our homeschooling journey. And then I know I've talked about it, but I was in kind of a homeschooling crisis, which happened a lot at the beginning, where you're like, I don't know if what I'm doing is working, and I don't know. And so I talked to this veteran homeschooling mom and just asked her, like, what's the key? And she said, I just figure my job is to help my kids learn how to be happy, good humans, something along the lines of that. And that was like a revelation to me, because I realized at that moment, like, well, what are my goals? I mean, I kind of had this goal of, like, I'd like them to be better prepared. But, like, that's coming back to the question we just asked. Like, what is it, how will I know I'm successful as a homeschooling mom?
Yeah.
Or
I think in general, how do you know if you're successful as a parent, perhaps, with your kids? And I think...
if you've never asked yourself that, how do you know if what you're doing is effective? If you don't even know, like, so we do all the things, right? Like, well, we got to get them into organized sports because that's good for them. Or we've got to make sure they get straight A's or get into a good college, and really like that they get braces so their teeth are straight, so that they, like, we have all of these things that every parent just knows you're supposed to be doing, and you feel kind of like this pressure all of the time. But how is that how you know, like, that your kids that you were a successful parent because they got into a good college and they have straight teeth and they have a driver's license and what?
Yeah.
Like, why? And so often when moms will say, maybe they have an answer for me, a lot of the times they don't. But I'll throw some things out there. Like, well, if your goal is college, that's going to look like one thing. But if your goal is just to have children that can provide for themselves, successfully provide for themselves, that might be college, but it might not. And so your goals, what you're doing now might change. If your goal is that they'll be, well-adjusted or be people of faith, or like, there's a million things. How do you know that when it's all said and done, if you homeschooled, what will mean that you're successful? And I think it's unfortunate that for most parents, it's college.
Well, and I think the reason that we have some of these benchmarks out there, like college and a good job, is because it all boils down to everybody wants their child to be a happy, healthy adult, and one that can provide that for themselves. And so we assume
Yeah, we don't. Yeah.
that these other things, like a college education, good grades, and a good job, in quotes, are the things that lead to that happiness, that happy, healthy, well-adjusted adult.
I think that we just assume, but it's like, yeah, but you have a college degree and you have, in quotes, a good job. How's it working for you? And I think if we actually looked into it, a lot of people are incredibly lost and unhappy.
Yeah. And so
Not everybody.
No, not everybody. And we are not going to claim that sending your child to public school and then them go through that process always produces unhappy adults, because that's not true.
No, but I
However,
think have you even asked yourself if it's effective for what you're seeking for your child? And not everybody's seeking the same things. And I am totally okay with that, because we don't want a bunch of like automatons or whatever, where we're all exactly the same.
Okay.
And we want different types of people who've had different types of experience. We want you to come to the table with different backgrounds, because it'll add a lot of complexity and wisdom and depth to the decisions that we end up making in this world, right?
Right.
But I think you should ask yourself as a parent and as an individual, is what I'm doing going to get me to where I want to go? And before you can ask yourself that, you have to say, where do I want to go? And I think ultimately, when I ask moms, if they say like, well, this, and I'll say, well, why that? And it's like, well, because it means this. And it's like, and why that? Like when we keep going and going and going, it's like, I want them to be able to provide for themselves in a way that makes them happy. I want them to be kind and good people. I want them to be smart, so that they can, navigate life effectively. And so then you got to write that down, and like really solidly say, this is what I'm going for. And then you can say, okay, so college might be important,
right?
But college is only a tool that might get you there.
Right,
college is not the destination.
Right.
And so we've always said to our kids, college is a tool.
Sure.
And you only pick up that tool if it's actually going to get you to where you want to go, because you're paying a lot for that tool.
Sure. Yeah.
And you don't just buy that tool if you're not even making something, like if it's not required for the thing you're trying to make.
Right.
And so, we could do an analogy with that. Like, you don't go buy an expensive saw if you're not woodworking, It's funny because it might not look that different in the end, except it's just been being done with intention.
Sure.
And I think which creates a lot of peace for people and a lot of clarity.
Yeah.
Instead of ending up at college like us and kind of wandering around, going to the student services office, taking these tests, and trying to figure out what you are and what you should do. And then getting all these reports on, like, I remember for a short amount of time, you thought about being a chiropractor. Because that job pays well. It was like a week and a half. But then somebody's like, do you know how many, they have so many chiropractors, like it's a really saturated market. So then we're like, well, let's go look at what's not saturated. Like, that's a good way to decide what you want to do.
Yeah, that it doesn't necessarily lead to happiness just because you're in a job that's
necessary. I mean, if, like, let's say you knew you were good at these things, and then you could say, like, I could actually really use my skills and the things I enjoy in this market, and it's also happens to be an underserved market, so I happen to have a lot of job security. Sure.
Yeah.
But it also doesn't matter. Like, let's say you would be an amazing chiropractor. It doesn't matter how saturated the market is. If you're an amazing chiropractor, you're probably going to do really well.
Yeah.
Because the market is not saturated with amazing chiropractors.
Sure.
Or any other job in the world. If it's the thing that just brings you joy.
Heart sing.
Now, I always want to add, because I think it doesn't get added very often, that jobs are not what we live for. We do not live for our employment. We do not live for our careers. Or at least, I don't think that anybody could find any research that supports that people whose number one priority in their life is their career are the happiest.
Yeah.
And you know what? I don't care if there were research that suggests that. Everybody just knows that you don't lay on your deathbed and said, I'm so glad that I earned so much.
Time in the office.
Yeah. I wish I would have spent more time in the office, sort of thing. I also think you have to be really careful in your goals that it's not all employment based for your children.
Or income producing based.
Yeah. Like, I think of course we want them to be able to provide for themselves, but why? So that they can have healthy, happy home lives.
Yeah.
And one of I think the craziest things that we're taught these days is that power and empowerment has to do with working for somebody else, or working, or just how you earn your income. Like that's the only power or joy found in, or success found in life.
Right.
Specifically to women these days. It's so ironic that we tell women that they're more empowered when they leave their own home, their own children and their own lives, and go work for somebody and build something that person believes in. Like, wow, now you're really powerful. It's like, why? Why is that more powerful? It doesn't bring you any more joy. We all know that.
Yeah.
Money doesn't bring you any more joy. I mean, absolutely being able to provide for yourself is important, but I think we've really forgotten that.
Yeah.
And for both, and right now specifically for women, because we're always pushing on like income inequality and talking like the amount of money you make has something to do with your value in this world, or your like, obviously these women are unhappy, or obviously they're not empowered. It's like, or maybe they don't think money is the most important thing in the world.
Right.
And so they've made different choices. I think it does happen to women, but I also think it happens to men. And so I try to make a more concerted effort. Like I was talking to Jude yesterday. He's our 8-year-old. And he was talking about what he wants to be when he grows up. And, he's like, wants to be a chef, because that's what he like idolizes his brother Daniel, who's 19. And Daniel wants to be a chef. And so, Jude's like, I like food. I like cooking. That's fun. And maybe he will be a chef, but I'm not going to hold him to it. But then something I hadn't done in the past that I do now. And I said, and also a dad. And he said, oh yeah, of course. Definitely a dad. I do that because I believe that being a parent is where real joy in life can come from. Part of where real joy in life can come from, and being a member of a family and having a happy home. And if we only talk about the things that take us up outside of our home as part of evidence for success,
yep,
then we're just communicating that the home is just an afterthought.
Right, that it's secondary.
Yeah, and so I think it's really important when you're talking about how you've had success as a parent is when your children can successfully set up a home life, a family life, that they're happy at home.
Right. Like,
who cares? I mean, there's like that Lego Batman where he's like super cool and powerful, and then he goes home and he's alone.
This huge.
And he's microwaving like lobster.
Yeah.
Right?
All by himself.
Yeah. And
looking into it as it's cooking.
Yeah, and I remember reading
kitchen.
something about like all like these celebrities who are just so famous and adored, and all these women want them, but they still eat alone every night at home. It's like, no matter how glamorous it seems to be, your job is ultimately what's not going to fulfill you.
Yeah.
It can be fulfilling.
Sure.
But ultimate fulfillment, I think we assert on this podcast, comes from your home life.
We'll come outside of employment or income producing activities, essentially. And I don't know, if that is your ultimate fulfillment, then maybe there's something's out of balance in your life. So
I guess that's where you get started with homeschooling.
Yeah. So that really, and it might seem arbitrary or not necessary,
or you might be in such a hurry to figure this thing out that I don't have time for that. I just got to get the curriculums.
Yeah.
But all of that, I mean, the curriculum it's
only useful if it serves the ultimate
tool.
goal.
Yeah.
And so
it's like, are you woodworking or are you gardening? Because those are very different tools, and curriculums are tools. And so it depends on what your goals are, and it depends on who your children are, and who, what their skills are, and their talents.
So I think we can agree that all parents ultimately want their children to be happy. And so the question is what you're doing leading them to that, and not making assumptions that certain hoops that we're asked to jump through by school or college or anything else is necessarily going to achieve that.
And I think most people would admit that money can't buy happiness.
I would think so. So
maybe you should slow down a bit and recognize that the best colleges and the top paying jobs, though it sounds, that you can't just assume that if your child becomes like a brain surgeon, they'll be happy.
Right.
And so, yes, that might be what they are so gifted in, and it will make them a lot of money. But you better make sure you're also helping them learn how to be happy at home.
Yeah. And that makes me think of, and I wasn't planning on talking about this, but I think what can also kind of mix up this whole process is that when children become the trophy for their parents, because we all want to look like good parents, we all want to be recognized as good parents. And if your child is getting the top grades and is admitted to the top colleges and getting the best jobs, that
they'll give you a bumper sticker for that.
that obviously reflects back on you as a parent. And so it's possible you might be pushing your child towards those things because you know that it's going to make you look good as a parent.
Yeah, it gets high societal points.
Right. So
if you say, oh, my son, the brain surgeon, that's a little bit different than saying my son, the plumber.
Right.
Though plumbers make really good livings and your child might be exceptionally happy as a plumber, that you don't get as many points in certain circles as if you said he was a brain surgeon. Like, oh, wow, fascinating. Like, wow, that's so cool that he's doing that.
And we all like that. We all want our children to have that
accomplished.
Success. Yeah, so that we look good.
I mean, you have to. I say we all like, but I think we intentionally check in on ourselves with that.
Yeah.
Like we've checked it enough that I think we've backed off of that.
Oh yeah. So I think we're recognizing that and saying, okay, am I pushing them toward this because it's going to look good? And being kind of aware of that motivation that might be there in the back, it may not be at the front, and it might be slight, but still it can get us to push our children to do things that might not be really in their best interests, and even though whatever, it can make them possibly successful in quotes, but is it really going to make them happy? Or
and I do think it's important to look at the outcomes you're getting,
right?
And say, if none of my children are finding success or able to, support themselves, then yes, something is breaking down.
Yeah.
So it is based in good things. You do want to always look at your outcomes because you can't divorce those and say, well, I did my job. They all, it is important still to say, none of my children are able to interact with the culture at large. None of them are able to keep a job down or hold a job down even as teenagers or whatever. So I do still think it's important to look at the outcomes that are being created by your methods.
Right.
But you always have to be careful that you aren't trying to make trophy children. And we've definitely been in circumstances where there's a lot of homeschooling parents there and they're throwing things out there like about what college their child's attending or whatever, what job they have, as if it's a mark that they were really good homeschoolers or something. And I mean, it's true to a certain degree.
Yeah, I mean, there's a balance. You
just have to be careful.
Yeah, because all those things are good.
Yeah.
But I think your motivations can sometimes make you do it for the wrong reasons.
Yeah.
So with that, I think we can talk about moving into kind of what we've done as far as what we hope for our children and how we're helping them get there. And what we have kind of decided is that we want our kids to learn how to learn how to be happy, and learn how to work.
Not in that order.
Not necessarily in that order. But those are kind of our basic goals for our children. And
you really could just say learn how to be happy, because learning and working are part of that.
Right. That's true.
But we didn't want it to be too ambiguous. And I think when we say learn how to be happy, we are talking a lot about how to be healthy emotionally, how to be spiritually healthy.
Yep.
And even physically healthy. That it's about like that whole mind and body kind of thing. And they all in overlap. So it's not like 1, 2, 3.
They're kind of was interwoven.
Yeah. We're just kind of pulling out specifics of the same thing, really.
Yeah. And so what we've kind of felt, or as we've worked on this over the past many years, we've sort of come to a spot where the way that we handle our education at home, our learning, a lot of it is a child-led kind of approach, right?
Yeah.
And that we want our kids to be interested in the things they're learning or engaging in, which means they have to sort of start that, or they can kind of decide what they want to learn about and what they want to do. And our job as parents in this homeschooling model, which some people call unschooling, but we don't really love that term because that kind of promotes
it's a big umbrella,
right. That's
with
a big
all sorts
umbrella.
of things that we're not a fan of.
So
like essentially unparenting.
yeah,
I think
basically
we talked about that
complete
before.
hands off, which is not what we want to do. But we kind of look at it more as an organic sort of learning experience for our kids. And when in that scenario where we see ourselves more as gardeners, and our children are the plants in this garden, and our job is to create an environment where they can grow.
Yeah.
And so I think we can talk a little bit about one of the places we have to start is creating a good environment or a good culture where our children can learn and grow. At least I think that's probably the
If
next
you were going to
natural
start
step.
with homeschooling, the first thing you have to think about is the soil that you're going to plant these plants in before you do anything else. If you've got these plants and you put them in the ground and then you think about the soil,
Sure.
it's a little bit harder. It's not impossible to amend the soil when the plants are in there, but it's so much easier to just work on the soil first.
Yeah.
And all of us are amending the soil, so to speak, as we are going
Well,
along.
it's a constant process.
Yeah.
So,
But it is the thing that you should focus on first, because so many things are taken care of when you have the proper culture set up and or a system set up. And then because we do believe that children will naturally want to learn and grow.
right. And maybe we should step back one more step, because a lot of this takes trust in children or in people in general, that children want to learn, they want to progress in life, and they will naturally do it if you let them. But it does take trust on the parent side. We have to trust that, and we've talked about this before, that every person is a genius, that every person has their strengths. They will find them, and they will naturally kind of grow in that if you let them do it. But you have to be willing, you have to trust them. You have to trust that they will and that they can.
Yeah, it's funny because it also is very natural to want to sit around and eat Doritos all day, right?
Yeah.
That's very
I've
natural
got some
too.
right now in my lap.
So we're not saying that just to completely let your children do anything all the time. So we do make our children do things they don't want to do.
Uh-huh.
We make them do chores. That's
Sure.
a huge part of, we feel, their education, so to speak. Like, they have to do chores, and they do a lot of chores.
Right, all day.
No, but they do a lot of
Well,
chores.
they
It's
each
not,
have at least one chore a day.
yeah, and they're not like pick up shoes or something. It's the dishes, and it's the dishes for a family right now of 10 people. It's a lot of dishes. I mean, anyways, I won't go into the details of that, but so we do make them do things they don't want to do, but we don't make them learn things necessarily that they don't want to learn, because we actually think that's impossible. And there's a lot of research to support us in that belief.
Okay, yeah.
So if you force someone to learn something they don't want to learn, they'll know enough to get maybe to regurgitate it to you for the test, but then it's gone. Humans don't like to be forced to learn things like that, to memorize and to do those things. When somebody's actually interested in something, the comprehension and the retention is so high.
Right.
But when it's forced upon them, and so it's not that what we do force is that they need to be learning something.
Right. We want to see you learning or engage in an activity.
Growing, yeah. And it might be, like I said, like, cutting up cardboard and gluing it together, and you're trusting that there's some learning going on and it's age appropriate. But we want them, so I do believe in doing things that you don't like to do sometimes, because you're learning to quiet that like inner toddler that's like wants to just lay around and eat Doritos.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's effective to do it with education, because then they're losing their joy of learning, and they're not really even learning. And so teach them how to push through and do the hard things with chores and things like that.
Physical tasks.
Yeah, and there will be a time when they get older, when they're learning things, and it requires now them to kind of move through a phase that's especially difficult. And I think if you've taught them how to work hard and to quiet that inner toddler through chores and the like, they will be able to take those skills to that thing that they're learning on, or that, opportunity that they're trying to handle.
Yeah. And because I think what we have to remember is that, again, our goal in homeschooling is sort of this holistic person that is healthy in their, they know things, they've learned things, but also they emotionally and personally are healthy. So, because I think we're also teaching when we don't let them act rudely toward their siblings.
Yeah.
Or we expect them to act a certain way in our family and to do certain things to kind of create a positive atmosphere at home. So in that way, we also don't just let that slide and we don't just let that go because that's also part of their education. That's part of learning. So it all starts to play together, but it starts with trusting your child that they want to learn and that they will learn, and not saying, okay, now you're going to sit down and you're going to learn these 10 facts about this thing. Because like you said, that's...
For us, that's almost like, it's like a forced marriage in a way. Like, I mean, not that the arranged marriages don't have a certain track record of success, but I will let them keep their love and let it be driven by love and interest when it comes to quote unquote like education or learning. No, but then teach them how to quiet and their inner toddler and to work hard and to do hard things in a different arena.
Okay, yeah.
And keep learning sacred and joy-filled.
Right. And they're choosing into whatever it is they're sort of they're engaged in as far as learning.
Can you imagine on a Friday night if you went to a movie, you and your spouse or a friend, if at the end you had to take a quiz about like all sorts of in-depth things about that movie, you'd be like, well, I'm not going to movies anymore because I wanted to go and enjoy this movie, which of course you are learning from that movie and it's giving you ideas and it's inspiring you or whatever, it's affecting you. But if you take the joy out of it, it's like, I don't want to do it anymore. That's just human nature.
You resist.
Yeah. And so, I believe in pushing through and doing hard things. And we definitely model that in our work for our kids and the things that we love. But we just are really careful about forcing them to learn.
Right. So, yeah, so there's the trust. And then we talked about earlier, there's the modeling that takes place. And this is another kind of overarching thing.
Part of that soil.
It doesn't just, it's not like this is an event that just happens and then you check that box. It's a constant. They have to see whoever happens to be at home, because not everyone can have mom and dad at home. But in our case, it's kind of nice. They can see mom and dad doing things, learning things, engaging in activities. And then they say, oh, I can do something too. And like you said yesterday, Jude is watching you work on a project. He goes and gets out some cardboard and starts putting things together. And that reminded me of when Asher used to do that. Because Asher for a long time was a cardboard artist. He would he would cut it up, he'd glue things together, and he'd put things together.
It's very mechanical.
And part of you thinks, this is
just a mess.
Is this good for him? Like, I don't see how this is going to help. But now he's moved on to blacksmithing, and he's making a knife right now, and he's onto more concrete sort of like projects he's doing that are a little more, that require more skill. And
you might listen to that and like, well, I don't want my son to be a blue collar worker. And you know what? They might be really happy being a blue collar worker, but also they might be learning just about how things come together, and that might shift to organizations eventually.
Sure.
He might go into management. You know, I mean, like really, I've heard a lot about that there's certain kinds of kids that when they're younger, they're taking apart radios and, that sort of thing. And they're not going to grow up to be an electrician, though that would be a great job if they loved it. But some of those kids transition into like, they now know how to make the operations of a company really effective. Right. They're just mechanical in that way, but they now, put it on a societal level or at a company level, a group level. So I think just trust that it is helping.
Right.
Now I don't, some people argue the same thing for video games, and that's where we draw the line. Sure, there's probably good things, but I also think video games are addictive. So I don't do that. But you know what? You might say that you don't, and I'm not going to argue with you. That's your home, and that's how you want to do it. That's just how we've approached it in our home. But we do use something that we didn't feel comfortable with a long time ago, which is like YouTube and movies. Just because you're like, oh, how can watching something be educational? But obviously, we've had a huge shift in our culture.
Yeah, well, there's so many instructive videos out there.
Yeah.
there's
And
so
it's
many
why is
people-
it better to read a book than to watch a movie? It's like, well, there might be some differences, but that doesn't mean that you throw out the movie completely.
Right.
Now, if we don't, you just have to make those decisions in your home. Another question I get asked all the time is by people who are homeschooling already. And they're like, oh, my kids just don't want to do anything. And, I really want these things for them. So I want them to be playing an instrument. I want them to be, reading. And all they want to do
By a
is,
certain point.
yeah, or just reading books more often. And they're complaining about their lack of motivation. And that's where we bring it. I once again will ask them, or I want them to speak a second language.
Right.
And I'll say, well, do you speak a second language? Actually, I very rarely have the guts to say this. But I'm thinking, do you speak a second language? Do you practice an instrument every day? Do you exercise? Do you, are you working on creative projects? Are you doing those things? Why in the world do you expect your child to speak multiple languages, to play an instrument, to, be reading all of the time if you never do that?
Yeah.
Children become adults, and they are very perceptive on a very subconscious level what adults do. And if your life consists of those things, then they will very naturally do those things.
Right.
And so if you are seeing like my kids don't do anything, I really think you should probably hold a mirror up to yourself and say, well, what do I do with my time?
Yeah.
I'm modeling what you become. And so I don't know if we've talked about this on here before, but I think it's really important, especially for moms, because we are more often the models for our kids. Now, kids are very aware of what dad is doing too, but are you showing your kids that an adult life is an interesting, varied one? Are you spending your time still learning and growing? Because what you're modeling for them is not just what they'll become, but what humans do in general.
Right.
And so if you take joy in reading, and if you're getting on the piano or, some sort of instrument and playing it, I think it'll be really simple. Other people will say, like, how did you get your kid to play an instrument? It's like, well, that's just part of what our family does.
Yeah.
Or that you speak another language. I think it's that when you normalize things in your culture by modeling them, kids just do it. And there's all sorts of research into this. This is how kids in indigenous cultures learn how to gain all the skills they need to be successful adults, is because they watch their parents. And when we've thought about different names for the type of education we do, and we thought about like papoose parenting or something. The papoose is like what the child rides in a lot of these cultures. The mom wears them.
Carries. Yeah.
We chose ultimately not to call it that because we are kind of in a sensitive culture right now. People might be a little offended at that appropriation or that term, but it's that idea of like, take them along and show them how to live. And you cannot just come up with a list of things that you want your children to be if you aren't those things.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't expect my child to be everything that I am, but I can't really expect them to be everything that I'm not either.
Right.
And I think that's another really important part of getting started in homeschooling, is if you're going to bring your kids home, make sure that you're still learning if you want them to be learning at home, and that you're still motivated if you want them to be motivated at home. We're like, oh, my teenagers are so unmotivated. That's part of it. I mean, they're tired and there's a lot of, hormones going through their body and makes them have some different desires. But I also think a teenager can be very excited to work and to do things if they see that adult life looks fun. But I think for most teenagers, I know myself included.
When you were a teenager.
When I was a teenager, adult life looked the worst. I said to my dad once, he was probably in his late 40s at this time. And I said, mid to late 40s, I said, do you ever wish that you could just go back and be like 18 again? And he was like, never. And I was like, what? Like, your life is so lame. All you do is go to work. And I laugh about it now because I understand that, like, my dad's thinking, you don't have a life. This is my life, but I think I did hear we forget that maybe we need to communicate to our kids the joy that we get out of being an adult.
Right.
Verbally communicate that, like actually say it. But also, have some evidence that they can just pick up on. If you're just sitting in the car in between lessons all the time, that might not be quite as motivating for your kids And so you might say, well, why aren't they motivated? Or, things along those lines.
Well, it's a good point. And because I think a lot of parents' lives can become just administrative.
Yeah.
As far as they just are involved in cleaning up after people, getting people from point A to point B. And to a child, that doesn't look very interesting. And so they might not necessarily be interested in following in your footsteps.
Yeah. And you're probably doing it for their sake.
Oh, yeah.
But it's like, you know what? You might think it would be selfish to do those things, but this is your life. This is not your children's life.
Yeah.
This is your one chance. You
As
are
an
the adult now. This is where you build your life. Now, like I've said, I think children and family come before career, but it's so much richer than just like taking people to things and, along those lines. Even just if you find joy in cooking everybody dinner and you really
show that.
Yeah, you really are like studying out and you're, those sorts of things. That looks like a good part of adult life too. I think it's just remembering that children become adults and you need to show them why they want to be.
Yeah. So I think
as part of being a good parent.
Yeah. So if your life is mostly administrative, basically as an adult, maybe you need to kind of shift things a little bit and give yourself some more free time to explore, hobbies or topics so that your kids can watch you do that. Because really, if all they see you doing is kind of the drudgery, in quotes, of adulthood, it doesn't motivate them to want to kind of move through the process and do what you're doing.
Or even just know how to. I think if you bring your kids home and you want to homeschool and you're like, I want them to learn, we take for granted that like they just know exactly how to go about that. Now, I think they do naturally want to learn, but learning is a skill. And that's why it's one of the things that we want our children to learn how to learn. It's like, I want to know about this thing, but I don't know where to get started. Well, one great thing you can do for your kids is to be really interested in something.
And be learning something new.
Yeah, be learning something new. So let's say, I remember when I was in high school, my mom was fascinated by Germany in pre-Nazi Germany. She was fascinated on how do you get to that point where Nazism takes hold. And I'm not saying I learned about a lot about Nazi Germany from her during that time, but what I saw her doing was consuming all of these books.
Right.
Thinking about it, talking about it. She went, she watched films on it. She went to a museum, in town on it. She was very absorbed into this idea for a time period. And then, she, I think, learned everything she wanted to learn and moved on to a different topic. I remember she got this huge book on Australia and read that. And she was always talking about it, here and there about Australia and the history of Australia. And I thought, that looks really boring. But what she was teaching me is how humans learn. And that's one of our beefs with school.
Yeah.
Is when you learn something, you don't just go for 10 minutes a day and, do this little thing.
Units.
When you are, as an adult, or most people, when you want to learn something, you just immerse yourself in it. You're watching things on it. You're reading things on it. You're reading, searching the internet and watching YouTube and talking to people or going to classes. And we love that about homeschooling, that it provides you the opportunity to really do that. And that's what my mom was teaching me.
Right.
That's what you do when you're interested in a subject. Or, my mom loved to do stained glass for a time period. And so she was doing that all the time. I remember it being out in the garage. I remember it being at the kitchen table, and then she didn't do it anymore. And she shouldn't. It's not, you don't need to feel guilty about it. She was just pursuing a new interest and learning how to do it. And she was modeling that for me.
Yeah.
Same with my dad he was really obsessed with bike riding, and he got the tools he needed for that, and he worked on that, and he, gave time to it all the time. And he became a, really solid cyclist. And so hobbies and interests, if you're bringing your kids home, that's something that you need to say, hey, now it's time for me. And the thing is, it's really enjoyable. So it shouldn't be a burden. It should be like, hey, actually, I've always wanted to do this. Maybe this is a great time. And like, you might think the opposite. I think a lot of homeschooling moms think now's the time for me to like lose myself completely because I'm going to be homeschooling my kids.
Yeah.
And it's like, no. This is the time to bring them home and to start going to the library, getting with them to check out books on things you're interested in.
Yeah.
And to be working on projects alongside them or in front of them, or to be visiting museums where you're interested in, not just children's museums.
Yep.
Bring them to the museums that you're fascinated by, and it will be infectious. Really, it will become part of your family culture. And it's so much more joy filled than I think a lot of moms and dads who are about to embark on homeschooling think it will be. They think they're about to put themselves on the altar of homeschooling.
Yeah, they're going to sacrifice themselves.
When really effective homeschooling is quite the opposite. So much of the homeschooling culture that's important is you pursuing learning and education alongside them or in front of them to allow them to do it, to excite them about what they want to learn about, and also to teach them how it's done.
That's great. Yeah. And then I think by doing that, they learn that it's okay to dive deep into a subject. And you also, just like, and you sort of said it, once you're done learning as much as you want to learn, you allow yourself to move on too. Another issue I have with public schooling is that they decide when and where you start and stop on a topic. And that is not natural to the learning process for any given human being. So it goes back to the trust. You trust yourself to learn as much as you want about a certain topic. So trust your child that they too, when they're interested in something, they'll learn about it. And when they're done, it's okay.
And they might pick it back up again. I remember reading about how that's actually a really important part. That there are these times when you're in intense phase of learning and taking in information. But there's also it's like every garden has a growth period.
Yep.
And you think nothing's happening in winter in that garden, but important things are happening below the surface that you can't see.
Yeah.
And it's the same with your kids. There will be times where they're not doing as much, but that may be really important for their brains.
Right.
It's like a processing time. And then they'll jump back into it again. There's an ebb and a flow.
Yeah.
And you have to understand that the ebb is as important as the flow.
Right.
Now, kids are also kids. And so they might get stuck in the ebb for sure.
Right.
And so you might have to say hey, you're what have you been doing lately? And we have one child we've been talking about the last few days who seems to be in a little bit of a rut. And you have to still, adults get in ruts too, and it's important to learn the skills of how to get out of a rut.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying that you should always let your kids, stare at a wall.
Again, and it's not this is not a completely hands-off approach, but it's kind of trusting and then being willing to, I guess, guide a little bit when it's needed.
Because you can tell. It's not as complicated as it sounds. You can tell when your kid seems to be in a little bit of a rut. They seem a little cranky maybe, or just a little lost. Not doing things that bring them joy, but also not looking like they're enjoying their time off either. They just seem to be wandering the halls of the house.
Right.
And so you can say hey, what are you interested in? How can I help you? And, kind of give them a little push or maybe a little encouragement or whatever, or some of our kids just don't ask for things as readily. And so you might notice, and then they'll say, actually, I do need this thing to do the thing I want to do.
Okay, yeah, here, I'll help you with that.
Yeah.
So yeah, being observant is definitely helpful. So we've talked for quite a while, and this is why we have to break this up into multiple podcasts, because it would take us a long time to get through everything.
But I guess if I said anything about getting started with homeschooling, is that I remember how I felt, and I know how a lot of parents feel when they come to me, and that it's going to be really hard but worth it. But I am here to say, after doing it for 12 years, that when you do it, when you get into it and you do it well, it's full of a lot of joy, and it's a lot more natural than you think it will be.
Right.
That humans kind of naturally educate themselves if you can just set up the proper environment or the soil for your children to grow in. And it's twofold, because it's great for education, but it also is just great for a good life too. It sets up a good life. And so if you're just about to get started, or it's what you have been doing in homeschooling isn't working, I will tell you that there is a place. There's a place for you. No, there is a way to homeschool that is full of joy, that has less strife, but also great results.
Right. Good progress and, I don't know, results, I guess is the word. But you'll see it happen. And it's magical when you start to watch it.
It's such a joy now, and I feel like I'll forget that other people are doing this other thing, and then they're having these problems, and then you're like, oh man, once you do it this way, a lot of those problems just fall away.
Yeah.
They're just not an issue anymore. Just like if you have a garden that you're constantly fighting against pests and you're constantly fighting against these things and your plants are never producing, maybe it's the soil.
Yeah.
Maybe if you would give them more nutrients, if you would set up the right environment for them to grow, you wouldn't have so many of those problems. And it's not a maybe, definitely.
Yeah.
And I feel that same way with homeschooling. If you can just set up the right culture in your home and the right environment, which you do by asking yourself what your goals are, then so many of the problems that parents so often complain about just don't exist. They really don't.
No.
They really, really don't. And there's a little bit more to that. We can talk about it like discipline and a culture of respect. But I just want you to know that life can be so good, and it doesn't have to be so hard all the time, that there's a lot of joy in homeschooling this way.
Yeah. Well, and it's a much easier route, in my opinion, especially to me, than sending your child to a compulsory education, whether it's private or public school, because so much can be taken up in just kind of, you're backpedaling as far as the things that they're learning, undoing maybe what's happening at that school that's coming home, and then you're kind of pushing back on that constantly.
It's just not worth it.
It is so much harder. It's so much harder, and there's so much more stress there when there's things happening at school and influences that your children are under at school.
And just the inherent pitfalls of a forced education or a compulsory education. It messes with people, and it creates bad behaviors. And if you don't believe us, read Dumbing Us Down or read Instead of Education. Both of those books really pull it apart for you and make you realize that so many of the issues we have at school come from the way we do school.
Yeah, it just can't work. And so I think people are afraid to homeschool because they think it's going to be harder because my kids are going to be around and I'm going to have to take care of them or whatever. I like the break, but man, the break isn't worth it when they come home and there's all this stuff you have to deal with as residual kind of effects of that education that's happening.
You won't need the break as much.
Yeah.
You won't need it because everybody will settle into a lot happier mode of operation.
Right. So just a quick little kind of plug on that. But I think we should probably wrap it up because we've been talking for a while. So we appreciate you coming along on this little discussion with us. We're going to have more about homeschooling and how we do it. And hopefully it's helpful for everyone out there listening. And you can take it and use the pieces that'll work for you and your family. We recognize every family is different. Every situation is different. But we feel like there are some principles that can be applied no matter what that will be helpful. And we hope that they are helpful to you.
Totally.
So, again, review the channel for us if you would, and come back next time. Will be next week, another episode. So that's it.
Thanks, guys.
We'll see you later.